FIDE Candidates 2022 Round 5 is concluded. This is the Round 5 recap. My name is Matt Jensen. I'm a national master, statistician, a chess coach, and I like helping people improve their chess using data-backed methods. So that's what Chess Goals is all about if it's your first time finding the Chess Goals community. In today's video, we're going to look at the odds of each player winning the candidates, both going into the tournament, going into the round, and after the round, and we're going to recap all 4 games. So going into this round, Caruana was the slight favorite still, Jan Nepomniachtchi close behind in second. That's because Caruana was expected to score a little bit better going forward. And then we see Nakamura riding in third place in the odds, sitting right around 14%. The first game that finished today was Alireza Firouzja with the white pieces against Jan-Christoph Duda with the black pieces. We see a Petrov defense, and the Petrov tends to be an opening that's pretty solid for black. Usually there's no big imbalances, and it's difficult for either side to play for a win. So one thing that we always talk about is kind of watching the clock. So we see an hour and 58 for Duda, hour and 49 for Alireza. The clocks can tell you how well prepared the players are for different openings. So all of this is pretty standard so far, just a very slight edge for white. If you look at the eval bar, it's around 0.3 for white. That's just because white moves first in the symmetric position. It's a little bit more active. The rook is already developed on e1 compared to its counterpart. The f1 knight is ready to come into g3, trying to target some of these light squares around the black king. But very small advantage up to this point. c6, knight g3. We see a trade of bishops. And now the imbalance is the comparison of the dark square bishops. Technically, the bishop for black on e7 is a good bishop because these pawns are on light squares. But in this position, with so much symmetry, not much going on, I don't think you can really claim any imbalance advantage there for black. So it's really still coming down to the fact that white has the rook on the e-file first and slightly better placed knights. That gives white a 0.3 edge. White connects the rooks. Black is also getting ready to connect the rooks after the queen moves, putting his rook on the e-file. Bishop to f6, pointing at d4. So at this point, I think there was a small chance for Firouzja to play for a larger advantage, a 0.4 advantage according to the engine, with pawn to c5. And what this is doing is it's creating a space advantage. It's kicking the knight on d6, and this pawn cramps the black position a little bit. But the downside to this move is it creates this weakness on d4. That's probably the weakest pawn on the board. So that's a very committal decision for Firouzja, but I think it was a nice improvement and maybe a way that he could have played for the win. He decided to go rook a to d1. A solid looking move. Maybe he'll play c5 coming up. But now I really like how Duda plays this. Duda is showing good form in this game. He trades rooks on e1 and then takes on c4 and finds this kind of cool move, pawn to b5, targeting the c4 pawn. And after the trades, this pawn on d4, where the bishop is already pointing at it, gets highlighted again as the weakest pawn on the board. So takes, and look at that. Isolated pawn on d4. Black's pawns are connected though. So I think at this point, if Firouzja wants to push the advantage, knight to h5 might be a good option. That's the engine's top choice. But we are very close to draw territory still. The more pieces that trade off in a symmetric pawn structure like this, the closer we get to a draw. Bishop to a5 played, pinning the knight to the queen. And coming up here, we have a couple really good moves in a row by Duda. Chess.com highlights them as great moves or brilliant moves. Okay, so the players are trading off. We have this dynamic of the d pawn for the b pawn, and we have a knight for a bishop. But it's really about balanced at this point. I think if white wants to play for the largest edge, follow the computer's advice, queen to b1, pointing at this pawn, and maybe threatening knight takes f6. If white could scoop up the b pawn for free, that would be obviously a way to play for a win with the extra d pawn, which is currently defended by the knight. But knight to c3 was played, queen d7, and coming up here, these pawns trade, and we see this brilliant move by Duda, bishop takes d4. So he had this calculated out. What's happening here is both sides have their kings behind the 3 pawns. Both sides have to think about back rank checkmates. Back rank checkmates are one of the most common tactics in chess, and bishop takes d4 works because of the back rank mate. So after knight takes d4, rook a1 check, Alireza has to block with the rook. And now there's another brilliant move by Duda. Queen takes d4. And the problem is, if white takes the queen, black takes the rook, and it's going to be a back rank mate. And if white takes the rook, black takes the rook, and then queen f1 has to be played, everything swaps off the board. And there's also kind of this cool dynamic. If rook takes rook, queen takes queen, then it's white that gets the back rank mate. So both sides have to think about the back rank mate. But let's just look at that sequence one more time. This was a nice move order by Duda, just forcing these trades. And after the trades, there's no way for Alireza to play for a win. Retreats his queen. They repeat back and forth a few times. So draw in this game. But a draw for Alireza with the white pieces against Duda will lower him a bit in the odds, because every time you have white, you need to play for the win, especially against the low-rated players in the field. So this is kind of a big miss for Alireza, who needs to get back into the event. Next, we have Fabiano against Richard Rapport, and we see a Sicilian with e6. So this tends to lead to a Taimanov or a Sicilian Khan. In this game, we see a Taimanov with knight to c6. The Khan would be pawn to a6. And I've played these positions quite a bit from the black side. The Sicilian Taimanov used to be my main weapon for black. And here we see g4, kind of an interesting idea by Fabi. It's very aggressive, kind of targeting this black king, which wants to go to g8. And I like how Fabi has been playing this tournament. He's not afraid to play for imbalanced positions and play for kingside attacks. So all of this is pretty standard still. We look at the clocks. Both players are around 1 hour and 50 minutes. Knight to a5 by Rapport. So what he's trying to do here is swap off the knight on b3. If you can get to an endgame with this sort of pawn structure, where black has the d pawn and white has the c pawn, the endgame tends to favor black. So I think something that Rapport could be thinking about here is, okay, I don't want to castle kingside because I see this g pawn out on g4. Maybe I can start trading off the pieces, get into a Sicilian endgame where I know I have a very slight advantage with the pawn structure. Queen to d2 played. I don't know if Fabiano's thinking queenside castle here because the pawn's already up on b5. He might just be trying to play solid. Knight takes b3 played by Rapport. This is a small mistake according to the engine. I think the reason knight takes b3 is not the best move is because look at that rook on a1. Now it just has this nagging pressure attacking the pawn on a6. So every time you have doubled pawns, even though the pawns are a potential weakness, if the doubled pawns open up a file for a rook, that can sometimes outweigh the weakness of the pawns being doubled, and that's the case here. So the doubled pawns are actually good for Fabiano. Bishop to b7 played, putting some pressure on e4. The top engine move here is f3, which looks a little bit funny, opening up the dark squares. Fabi chooses bishop g2, second best move. Now, interestingly, he plays rook to f1. I think he's being a bit coy here. He's not really telling what his plans are. Queenside castle is probably the most logical move, and just letting black know right away, I'm going to castle queenside, but it's a quick developing move, and then you can go after the black king. Instead, he plays rook to f1, and after bishop c6, he plays g5. So I think there was some hesitation by Fabi. Didn't really want his king over on the c1 square, removing the rook from the a file with queenside castle. So he's just going to leave his king in the center. It's a pretty interesting position, and if you look at the clocks, Fabi's already down to 1 hour, and we're only on move 13. So he has to make another 27 moves in 1 hour. So getting a little bit low on the clock. Pawn to a5. This is now discouraging Fabi from castling queenside. You see that pawn coming very quickly. It's going to be a tough decision to castle over there. So Fabi plays pawn to f4. a4 by Rapport. Rook to d1. So Fabi's keeping his king on e1, nestled in between the two rooks, and Rapport is keeping the king on e8. So this is going to be an interesting game. Who can open up the center and get a stronger attack? If Fabi can get a win here against Rapport with the white pieces, that's going to tie him with Nepomniachtchi with a +2 score, and it'll be up to Jan to see if he can win his game to stay in the sole lead. Bishop to b4, queen d4, queen a5, queen takes g7. This position looks really crazy. It looks like there's not going to be any chance of a draw. Both sides have their kings in the middle. King's under attack, and now we see a3 by Rapport, threatening to take on b2. That pawn is getting very close to promoting to a queen. King f2, a takes b2, knight back to e2, and this is the move of the game by Rapport. He finds pawn to e5. If Rapport doesn't play e5, there's actually a very big advantage for white because pawn to f5 is coming next, dislodging the knight and getting ready to open up this king. Bobby wants to hide his king on g1 and have the rook barreling down the f-file. So e5 was played. f5, top move by the engine. Here, Fabi could play a move like f takes e5 or king to g1. Both of those start to give black an advantage, though, and this pawn on b2 is very dangerous for white. So Fabiano spent quite a bit of time around this moment. See, he's at 39 minutes. He spent 7 minutes to play f5, and in the last couple moves, he spent a lot of time too, thinking about this f5 decision. He knew it was coming up. After f5, there's a repetition for Rapport. If he does not find the repetition, he's completely lost because this knight defends the rook, so the knight can't move and it's being attacked by a pawn. The repetition is bishop to f8, back to e7, and this queen has to go g7, f6, back and forth. So the players shuffle back and forth and agree to a draw. So I think the draw is a better result for Rapport. He's the lower rated player with the black pieces. 24 moves, gets the draw against Fabiano, one of the favorites in the tournament. Now moving on, Hikaru against Jan Nepomniachtchi. This is a huge game. Nepo's in the lead with a +2 score. Hikaru's at an equal score. Hikaru really wants this win because this would put him in a tie for first. He can beat Nepo with the white pieces. Everyone will be +1, Nepo, Caruana, and Nakamura. We see another Petrov defense. So can Hikaru create some winning chances out of this? c4, this is pretty aggressive. Looking for this imbalance. If those pawns trade off, Hikaru has an isolated queen pawn, but also more space in the center. So he avoids the trade. No knight takes d3. Knight c3, and this is all booked so far. The players are playing very quickly, hour 56, hour 47. Okay, we see this trade occur. Still have the same pieces on the board, but there's one imbalance. The c4 pawn for the b7 pawn. This slightly favors white. So it's similar to the first game we looked at with Firouzja and JKD. Very slight advantage for white out of the Petrov. Rook e1, rook e8, rook a2. Kind of a cool move. With the idea of maybe stacking rooks later. C takes d, queen takes. Nothing too crazy going on here. But look what happens on the next move. Pawn to c4 by Hikaru. This queen should go back to d7 or d6. Black is completely safe, has dodged all the issues in the opening, and it's actually white that has the weakest pawn on the board, the pawn on d4, and the pawn on a3 is being attacked by the f8 bishop. If Jan retreats his queen here, he can claim that he has at least equality in this position. But he makes a small mistake. He plays queen to e4. This gives Hikaru some chances. The problem with queen to e4 is this queen is going to get harassed. Bishop to f1 played, the strongest move. So now the queen's attacked. And if you look at her available squares, there's only queen to b1 and queen to g4 available. The strongest move is queen to b1, and that's about a half a pawn advantage for white. Instead, Jan plays queen to g4. It's a blunder, and now we're at a +2.5 territory. Hikaru playing for the win, and he finds the top move, pawn to h3, attacking the queen. And the idea is d5 is coming next, maybe bishop to b2 on the long diagonal. Hikaru's pieces are all of a sudden all jumping to life, and this queen doesn't have a lot of good squares for black. Rook takes e1, that's the top move. Queen takes back, and now Jan offers the queen trade with queen to e4. The best reply, rook e2, is what Naka played. It's a great move. Queen to d3, and now he plays rook to b2, and the queen goes back to e4. So all of a sudden now, Hikaru's thinking, okay, how do I avoid this queen trade and really try to press the advantage? He repeats with rook to e2, queen to d3, and if you look at the clock, Hikaru has 42 minutes to Jan's 1 hour. We're on move 22. So we got 18 moves left to reach time control. That's still a pretty good amount of time, over 2 minutes to move for Hikaru. But how does he improve on rook back to b2? He finds a way, rook to e3. Knight to h4 is also a good move here. That's the top suggestion for the engine. So this is also good. Rook to e3. Queen to b1, only safe square for the queen. And now d5. So Hikaru is still over +2, playing for the win, but keep an eye on the clock. So we got 1 hour for Jan, and we have 31 minutes for Hikaru. Remember, there's no increment until they hit move 60. So Hikaru has to use that 31 minutes for the next 16 moves. He's under 2 minutes a move. Knight e7, and now knight to d2 by Hikaru. That's a small mistake. The best move here is pawn to g4. I'm actually shocked that Hikaru did not play this. In his other games, we've talked about this. He keeps playing h6, g5, pushing pawns in front of his king to attack the opponent's king. That's exactly what he needed to do here. He should play pawn to g4, attacking this bishop, and trying to expose the black king. Knight to d4 is the second best move, activating the knight, putting it on a strong center square, attacking that bishop on f5. But okay, he plays knight to d2. Small mistake. Queen a1 by Jan, and Jan is playing very fast here, so he still has 55 minutes. Knight to b3, attacking the queen. Queen f6. Look at this guy. Jan is playing instantly. He's playing with confidence. That's very hard to face psychologically, and Hikaru is burning time trying to find these moves. Bishop to d2. Knight to g6. Another top move by Jan. Jan's playing perfect chess, and he's playing these moves very close to instantly. Knight to a5. This is a mistake by Hikaru. This starts to give away most of the advantage. What he should play here is a move like pawn to g3, which is kind of deep, but the idea is put the bishop on g2, the long diagonal, and maybe you get that queenside pressure. So Hikaru's move goes for the queenside pressure. It's just not quite as good because after b6, there's not a great square to put the knight, and these pawns are actually pretty safe for Jan. Puts the knight on to c6. The only thing it attacks from there is this pawn on a7, which can be moved. And look at the clocks, 52 minutes to 13 minutes. I really kind of like this time control where they don't have the increment because the clocks become a much bigger factor. Players have to constantly be looking how many moves left, how much time is on the clock, and they really have to factor that into their decision making. So bishop to d7 was played by Jan. And here Hikaru plays bishop to c3. After the queen moves bishop to b4, the queen has to go back, and Hikaru repeats. There is a chance for Hikaru to play on, but the problem is the clocks. The eval is only 0.3, but you have 49 minutes for Jan, 10 minutes for Hikaru. They still have to make 8 moves, and the players just repeated a couple more times, quickly agreed to a draw. We see 6 minutes on the clock for Hikaru. So 3 draws so far. Hikaru had a missed opportunity there to play for a win. That definitely would have been a huge win and completely shaken up the rest of the tournament. He wasn't able to secure it. Going into the 4th game, we have battle between Ding Liren with the black pieces and Timur Radjabov with the white pieces. Timur needs a win here. He needs to get back into the event. Ding also needs a win to get on an equal score so that he can kind of rejoin the leaders. So in this game, we have a Bogo Indian. So almost was going for a Catalan, but with the early bishop to b4 check, this takes us into Bogo Indian territory. Knight to d2. This is recommended in the Chess Goals Catalan course. And right now, the course is 25% off. Link is down in the description. I exactly recommend this line with knight d2. All right, so this is all pretty standard. We're looking at a book line. On to b3. Both players over an hour and 55 minutes on the clock. Bishop b2. The idea here is white wants to control this e5 square. Both bishops are on long diagonals for white. Very small pull, right around 0.2 advantage for white. Rook to c8, rook to c1. This is all making sense. We have a lot of symmetry here. C takes, bishop takes. And remember, Ding Liren's the one with the black pieces. He's the favorite in terms of rating, but the white pieces give Timur an advantage. So both of these players do want to play for a win in this game. We see this trade happen. Now the pawns are completely symmetric. The eval is 0.00, but watch how Ding Liren actually outplays Timur a little bit in this middle game. I'm going to fast forward a bit until the eval starts to change, just to show you what Ding's able to do here. Timur overextends a little bit in the center, pawn on e4, pawn on f4. The engine's not complaining about this, but keep in mind, every time you push a pawn, it creates some weaknesses behind the pawns, and the pawns can also become targets. This is something that happens in our games too, not just for super grandmasters. Be very careful pushing the pawns too far. Knight to c4, queen to b7. Look at it starting. Queen pins the e pawn, which is a little bit vulnerable. It's double attacked right now, only defended once. We see a3 and rook e1. So now white has to play a bit passively, keeping the e4 pawn defended. b5 by Ding. This is now a half a pawn advantage for black. This knight is being kicked on c4, and this rook is kind of ready to come into white's position when the moment's right, if the right pieces get traded off. Knight d2, pawn to a6. Very solid. So that pawn on b5 was double attacked. Pawn to a6 simply defends it. Knight f3, knight to e7, h6. This is just a nice move, preventing knight g5, watching the back rank mate threats. Bishop back to b6, getting the rook ready to come in. All very simple moves by Ding Liren. Radja's playing good as well until this move, pawn to h3. This actually allows black to gain an edge over 1 point according to Stockfish. Pawn to b4 is the best move here. If you look at the imbalance of the bishops, Ding Liren's bishop is on the opposite color of his pawns. That's a good piece, cutting through the position. This b2 bishop is on a good long diagonal, pointing at g7, but after b4, the bishop is on the same color as these pawns. That's technically a bad bishop. So I don't know if that was part of the decision to play h3. After h3, rook to d8, black now has an advantage of 1.2 according to the computer. Queen c2 played, rook back to c8, so they jockey for position a little bit. Players tend to do this with no increment. They want to reach that move 40, and they both have 30 minutes at move 29. So they want to gain a little bit of time here by making a couple moves. Pawn to h5. Nice move, trying to poke at white's kingside structure. h4. So the problem here for white is if black's able to potentially play h4, that weakens these pawns on the dark squares. Those pawns could be targeted by that bishop or the queen or potentially the knight coming to h5. So h4 is a way to just try to keep that kingside solid. The downside of h4 is that opens up g4. So compare the king safety. King on g8, very safe. Only the h pawn is moved. King on g2, it's on this diagonal of black's queen. There's a hole on g4. There's a pawn weakness on e4. This is what happens when you push too many pawns in front of your king. There's that potential that your king safety could be in danger. Knight to g4. Queen c3 by Radja, putting it on the long diagonal. But a big advantage is coming up here. Okay, we see a little bit of repetition. Knight back to g4, just fast forwarding a little bit. At this point, rook to c4 played by black. And this is a tricky move. The engine's not in love with rook to c4. The engine says maybe knight to c6 here is the best. Maybe queen back to b7. But I like rook to c4. It's putting a tough question on white. The best move in the position is actually knight f5, which takes a lot of calculation, and the players only have 18 and 22 minutes. And they're at move 35. So there's not a lot of time here to figure out the tactics to find knight f5. Queen to e2 was played, and this gives an advantage again to Ding Liren, 1.56. Queen back to b7, so getting on this diagonal, tying white's queen down to the defense of the e-pawn. Queen back to d3. Now we see f6, another good move by Ding Liren. Just slowly improving the position. This f-pawn blocks the diagonal, and there's also maybe the idea of playing e5 or meeting e5 with f5, probably more importantly, locking up all these pawns on the dark squares for white with the dark squared bishop. So that would be a huge strategic edge for Ding Liren. King h3, queen c8, pawn to e5, a blunder. Move 39, he only had 1 minute on the clock. This has been a problem for Radja all tournament. His clock gets very low, there's no increment, and he's struggling to make move 40 without making blunders. E5, massive blunder. We're looking at a 5-point advantage for black. Dingler N is in the driver's seat, ready to get back into this tournament. The best move here is pawn to F5. He has 9 minutes to find it. That's a 5.3 advantage. And the idea with pawn to F5 is, like we talked about, you just fix all of these all the white pawns on dark squares, same color as the bishop. Instead, he plays F takes E. That's a small mistake. This puts the advantage back to around 3 points. Knight takes E5 is the top move, but we aren't quite at the move 40 bonus yet. Another small mistake made by white. Now there's 5 minutes for Ding with a 4.5 advantage. The best move is bishop takes D4. So after bishop takes D4, the knight can plant on F5. This is a massive strategic edge. That bishop is terrible. The knights are both very good for black. This is the classic good knight against bad bishop imbalance that favors black. Dingler N is definitely playing for the win here. In the game, though, he did not find it. He did not find bishop takes D4. That was the only move that gave an advantage. He played pawn to G6, and the strongest move here by Radjabov, knight to G5, he was able to find. It only took him 2 minutes, and now we're in this symmetric position with equal chances for both sides. And this game peters out into a draw. Queens come off the board, knights come off the board, everything's trading. Rook and pawn endgame, equal pawns, draw agreed. So 4 draws this round. How does this affect the odds going into the next round? Here we go. Because Jan drew with the black pieces, that allows him to increase in the odds. Caruana drew with white. He decreases in the odds. And now Nepo is slightly ahead of Caruana going forward. The other players all stayed pretty consistent. They changed slightly based on which color and who they played. But Nakamura is the only one above 10%. The rest of the field is sitting around 5% or less. So at this point, it's kind of a 2-player race between Nepomniachtchi and Caruana until someone else gets a win. Nakamura is sitting in third, really looking to get that first +1. Yeah, I think he's going to get it. He feels like he's in good form. He's missed a couple little chances, but he's had those chances to get that first +1 score. Remember, he started -1 and then bounced back to get to equal. So that's the round 5 recap. I'll be back tomorrow for round number 6. Thanks for watching.